Ulysses S. Grant was an Ohio-born soldier and a transformative American figure who became one of the most consequential leaders of the 19th century. Hiram Ulysses Grant, Union General and later President, was born in Point Pleasant, Ohio on April 27, 1822. He came from humble origins. He had an unassuming demeanor that belied his determination. Grant's early years were marked by quiet competence and an aversion to pretense. He attended the United States Military Academy at West Point, gaining admission through a congressional appointment in 1839. His congressman mistakenly registered him as Ulysses S. Grant instead of his birth name, and the error stuck. He graduated in 1843, ranking 21st in a class of 39 cadets. His education there provided him with military fundamentals, though nothing suggested he would become one of history's great commanders. After graduating from West Point, Grant was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the infantry and assigned to Jefferson Barracks near St. Louis. When the Mexican-American War began in 1846, Grant's regiment was sent to join General Zachary Taylor's army in Texas. Despite his personal opposition to the war, which he considered unjust, Grant served with distinction. He participated in most of the major battles under both Taylor and later General Winfield Scott. At Monterrey, he showed courage under fire. During the assault on Mexico City, he demonstrated initiative and resourcefulness, hauling a howitzer into a church belfry to fire on enemy positions. The Mexican War taught Grant valuable lessons about leadership, logistics, and the importance of aggressive action. He emerged from the conflict as a seasoned combat officer with a brevet promotion to captain. Following the Mexican War, Grant married Julia Dent in 1848, beginning a partnership that would sustain him through the trials ahead. They would eventually have 4 children together. Grant was posted to various frontier assignments, including a particularly difficult stint in California and Oregon Territory. Separated from his family and struggling with loneliness, Grant began drinking, a problem that would haunt his reputation throughout his life. In 1854, facing allegations of drunkenness and seeing no future in the peacetime army, Grant resigned his commission. His resignation was neither glorious nor scandalous, simply the quiet departure of an officer who seemed to have reached a dead end. The next 7 years were the darkest period of Grant's life. He returned to Missouri and tried to make a living as a farmer on land his wife owned. He built a house with his own hands, which he named Hardscrabble, a fitting description of his circumstances. Farming proved unsuccessful. Grant lacked both the capital and the temperament for agricultural success. He tried selling firewood in St. Louis, a humiliating occupation for a West Point graduate and Mexican War veteran. He pawned his watch to buy Christmas presents for his family. In 1858, he was forced to give up farming entirely. Grant then worked for his father-in-law in a real estate office in St. Louis, but this venture also failed. By 1860, he had moved to Galena, Illinois, where he worked as a clerk in his father's leather goods store. At age 38, Ulysses Grant appeared to be a failure at everything he had attempted since leaving the army. He was supporting his family on a clerk's wages, working for his younger brothers in his father's business. Few who knew him in Galena would have predicted greatness in his future. Yet this period of hardship and humiliation may have prepared Grant for the challenges ahead, teaching him perseverance and humility. When the Civil War began in April 1861, Grant immediately sought to return to military service. He helped organize and drill volunteer companies in Galena, then traveled to Springfield to offer his services to the state of Illinois. Initially, his offers were ignored. He was passed over for positions given to men with less military experience but better political connections. Finally, in June 1861, Illinois Governor Richard Yates appointed Grant colonel of the 21st Illinois Infantry, an unruly regiment that previous commanders had failed to discipline. Grant quickly brought order to the unit through firm but fair leadership. His Mexican War experience and West Point training gave him an authority that the volunteers respected. Grant's competence came to the attention of Congressman Elihu Washburn, who became his political patron. Through Washburn's influence, Grant was appointed Brigadier General of Volunteers in August 1861. He was assigned to command the District of Southeast Missouri, with headquarters at Cairo, Illinois, a strategic position at the junction of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. Grant immediately began preparing his forces for offensive operations, demonstrating the aggressive instincts that would characterize his entire military career. In November 1861, Grant conducted his first operation, an attack on the Confederate camp at Belmont, Missouri. The battle was tactically inconclusive, but it gave Grant's troops combat experience and demonstrated his willingness to take the initiative. More importantly, it established Grant as an active, aggressive commander in a war where too many Union generals seemed paralyzed by caution. While other commanders drilled their troops and made excuses, Grant looked for opportunities to strike the enemy. In February 1862, Grant launched the campaign that would make his reputation. Working in conjunction with Flag Officer Andrew Foote's gunboats, Grant moved against Fort Henry on the Tennessee River. The fort fell quickly to the gunboats before Grant's infantry could arrive. Grant immediately marched his army overland to invest Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. Fort Donelson was a much stronger position, garrisoned by 15,000 Confederate troops. Grant laid siege to the fort while Foote's gunboats bombarded it from the river. On February 15, the Confederate garrison attempted to break out, launching a surprise attack that drove back part of Grant's line. When Grant arrived at the crisis point, he immediately recognized that the Confederates had weakened their entrenchments to mass troops for the breakout attempt. He ordered counterattacks all along the line. The Confederate breakout failed, and the garrison was trapped. When the Confederate commander requested terms of surrender, Grant replied with words that electrified the North: "No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted." The phrase, unconditional surrender, Grant became a Northern rallying cry, and the general's initials suddenly seemed prophetic. The capture of Fort Donelson was the first major Union victory of the war. It opened the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers to Union penetration deep into the Confederacy. It forced the Confederates to abandon Nashville and much of Tennessee. It made Grant a national hero overnight. He was promoted to Major General and given command of the Army of the Tennessee. After months of defeats and disappointments, the North finally had a winning general. Grant's next operation nearly ended his career. In early April 1862, his army was encamped at Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River near a small church called Shiloh. Grant was waiting for reinforcements under General Don Carlos Buell before advancing on the Confederate rail junction at Corinth, Mississippi. On the morning of April 6, Confederate forces under General Albert Sidney Johnston launched a massive surprise attack. Grant's army was caught unprepared. Thousands of raw Union recruits fled in panic. The Confederate assault drove the Union forces back toward the river in confused fighting through woods and fields. Grant, who had been at his headquarters several miles away when the attack began, rushed to the battlefield and spent the day organizing a defensive line and rallying his troops. Despite being forced back nearly to the river, the Union line held until nightfall. That evening, Buell's reinforcements began arriving. Grant decided to counterattack the next morning. On April 7, the Union forces drove the Confederates back, recapturing the ground lost the previous day. The Confederates, who had lost Johnston to a wound on the first day, retreated to Corinth. Shiloh was the bloodiest battle yet fought in the Western Hemisphere, with over 23,000 casualties in 2 days. The carnage shocked both North and South. Grant was criticized for being surprised and for the heavy Union losses. Newspapers called for his removal. There were renewed rumors of drunkenness. President Lincoln, however, refused to replace Grant, reportedly saying, "I can't spare this man, he fights." Lincoln recognized what many politicians and newspaper editors did not: Grant was willing to fight and to accept casualties in pursuit of victory. In a war that would ultimately be won through relentless pressure and superior resources, these qualities were essential. In the fall of 1862, Grant began planning the campaign that would become his masterpiece, the capture of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Vicksburg was the key to Confederate control of the Mississippi River. Perched on high bluffs overlooking the river, heavily fortified and stubbornly defended, Vicksburg was considered nearly impregnable. Lincoln called it the key and said the war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket. Grant spent the next 8 months trying to find that key. Grant's Vicksburg campaign was a study in persistence and adaptability. He tried multiple approaches, digging canals to bypass the city's guns, attacking through the swamps and bayous north of the city, attempting to approach from the east through Mississippi's interior. Each attempt failed or proved impractical. His subordinates grew frustrated. Newspapers renewed their calls for his removal. Politicians questioned his competence. Grant simply kept trying different approaches, learning from each failure. Finally, in the spring of 1863, Grant conceived a daring plan. He would march his army down the western bank of the Mississippi, south of Vicksburg, then use the navy to ferry his troops across the river below the city. This would place his army on the high ground east of Vicksburg, cutting the city off from reinforcement and supply. The plan required running gunboats and supply barges past Vicksburg's batteries at night, then operating deep in enemy territory without a secure supply line. It was risky, but Grant believed it would work. In April 1863, Grant put his plan into motion. The Navy successfully ran past Vicksburg's guns. Grant marched his army south, crossed the river, and then, instead of moving directly on Vicksburg, he marched northeast into Mississippi's interior. In a brilliant campaign of maneuver, Grant defeated Confederate forces at Port Gibson, Raymond, Jackson, Champion Hill, and Big Black River Bridge. He destroyed the rail junction at Jackson, eliminated Confederate forces that might have reinforced Vicksburg, and approached the city from the east, the one direction where its defenses were weakest. Grant attempted 2 assaults on Vicksburg's fortifications in May, both of which failed with heavy casualties. He then settled into siege operations, surrounding the city and cutting it off from all supply and reinforcement. For 6 weeks, Grant's artillery bombarded the city while his army tightened the noose. Inside Vicksburg, Confederate soldiers and civilians were reduced to near starvation. On July 4, 1863, the Confederate commander surrendered the garrison of nearly 30,000 men. Combined with the Union victory at Gettysburg the previous day, Vicksburg marked the turning point of the war. The Mississippi River was now under Union control, splitting the Confederacy in two. Grant's Vicksburg campaign is considered one of the most brilliant in military history. His willingness to take risks, his operational flexibility, his ability to learn from failure, and his understanding of logistics and maneuver demonstrated strategic genius. He was promoted to Major General in the regular army and given command of the military division of the Mississippi, encompassing all Union forces between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. In October 1863, Grant was sent to Chattanooga, Tennessee, where a Union army was besieged and starving. Grant immediately opened a supply line, the Cracker Line, to feed the troops. He then planned an offensive to break the Confederate siege. In late November, Union forces attacked the Confederate positions on Missionary Ridge and Lookout Mountain. The attack succeeded beyond expectations, with Union troops storming up the steep slopes of Missionary Ridge in an unplanned assault that routed the Confederate army. The victory secured Union control of Tennessee and opened the way for an invasion of Georgia. In March 1864, President Lincoln promoted Grant to Lieutenant General and gave him command of all Union armies. Grant was now the first man since George Washington to hold that rank. He established his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac in Virginia, determined to personally direct operations against Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Grant's strategy was simple but brutal: apply constant pressure on all fronts, preventing the Confederacy from shifting forces to meet threats, and use the Union's superior numbers and resources to wear down Confederate resistance. In May 1864, Grant launched his overland campaign against Lee. The two armies fought a series of savage battles: the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Court House, North Anna, and Cold Harbor. Each battle cost thousands of casualties. Unlike previous Union commanders who had retreated after such bloodletting, Grant kept moving forward, sliding around Lee's flank, forcing Lee to fall back to defend Richmond. The campaign was a war of attrition, and Grant was willing to accept the casualties necessary to achieve victory. His critics called him a butcher. His supporters recognized that he was doing what needed to be done to end the war. By June 1864, Grant had maneuvered Lee's army into the defenses of Petersburg, south of Richmond. Grant settled into siege operations, gradually extending his lines to cut Lee's supply routes. The siege of Petersburg lasted 9 months, with constant skirmishing and occasional major assaults. Grant coordinated operations across all theaters, ensuring that Confederate forces were under pressure everywhere. In Georgia, General William Sherman captured Atlanta and marched to the sea. In the Shenandoah Valley, General Philip Sheridan defeated Confederate forces and destroyed the valley's agricultural resources. The Confederacy was being systematically dismantled. In April 1865, Grant finally broke Lee's lines at Petersburg. Lee's army retreated west, hoping to escape and continue the fight. Grant pursued relentlessly, cutting off escape routes and destroying Confederate supply trains. On April 9, 1865, surrounded and outnumbered, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Court House. Grant's surrender terms were generous. Confederate soldiers could go home, officers could keep their sidearms, and men who owned horses could keep them for spring plowing. Grant wanted reconciliation, not revenge. His generosity at Appomattox set the tone for the immediate post-war period. Grant emerged from the war as the Union's greatest military hero. He had risen from obscurity to command all Union armies. He had captured 3 Confederate armies and defeated the Confederacy's best general. His strategic vision, operational skill, and moral courage had been essential to Union victory. He was promoted to full general, a rank created specifically for him, and served as commanding general of the army during the early Reconstruction period. Grant's post-war military service was complicated by political conflicts. He found himself caught between President Andrew Johnson and Congress over Reconstruction policy. Grant sympathized with the radical Republicans who wanted to protect the rights of freed slaves, but his position required him to work with Johnson. When Johnson attempted to remove Secretary of War Edwin Stanton in violation of the Tenure of Office Act, Grant briefly served as interim secretary but then stepped aside when the Senate refused to confirm Stanton's removal. Johnson felt betrayed and publicly attacked Grant, but Grant's reputation survived Johnson's anger. In 1868, the Republican Party nominated Grant for president. He won easily, carrying 26 of 34 states. At age 46, he became the youngest president elected up to that time. His presidency would prove far more difficult than his military career. Grant entered the White House with no political experience and little understanding of the complexities of governance. He was a better general than politician, and his 2 terms as president were marked by both achievements and failures. Grant's presidency focused heavily on Reconstruction and civil rights. He supported the 15th Amendment, guaranteeing voting rights regardless of race. He signed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, prohibiting discrimination in public accommodations. He used federal troops and the Justice Department to suppress the Ku Klux Klan and protect African American voters in the South. Grant's commitment to civil rights was genuine and consistent, even when it became politically unpopular. His administration achieved significant, if temporary, progress in protecting the rights of freed slaves. However, Grant's presidency was plagued by scandals involving subordinates and appointees. Grant himself was honest, but he was too trusting and too loyal to friends who betrayed that trust. The Credit Mobilier scandal, the whiskey ring, the Indian Trading Post scandal, and various other corruption cases tarnished his administration. Grant was never personally implicated in corruption, but his poor judgment in appointments and his stubborn defense of crooked subordinates damaged his reputation. His private secretary was involved in the whiskey ring. His Secretary of War was impeached for accepting bribes. Grant's loyalty to these men, while admirable on a personal level, was politically disastrous. Grant's economic policies were orthodox for the time but contributed to the Panic of 1873, a severe economic depression. His foreign policy was generally successful, resolving disputes with Britain and avoiding war with Spain over Cuba. His Indian policy was well-intentioned but ultimately ineffective, failing to prevent continued conflict and injustice toward Native Americans. Overall, Grant's presidency was a mixture of important achievements in civil rights and damaging failures in administration and economic policy. Grant left office in 1877 and embarked on a world tour with his wife Julia. They were received as celebrities everywhere, meeting with Queen Victoria, Pope Leo XIII, Otto von Bismarck, and other world leaders. The tour restored some of Grant's tarnished reputation. When he returned to America in 1879, there was a movement to nominate him for a 3rd term, but the effort failed at the Republican convention. Grant settled in New York City and became a partner in a financial firm, Grant & Ward. He invested his savings and borrowed money to invest more, believing his partner Ferdinand Ward was a financial genius. In 1884, the firm collapsed. Ward had been running a Ponzi scheme. Grant lost everything. At age 62, the former president was bankrupt, his reputation damaged again, this time by financial naivete rather than political scandal. Worse news followed. Grant was diagnosed with throat cancer, likely caused by his lifelong cigar smoking. Facing death and bankruptcy, Grant decided to write his memoirs to provide for his family. He signed a contract with Mark Twain's publishing company and began writing. Despite increasing pain and difficulty speaking, Grant worked on his memoirs with remarkable discipline. He wrote in longhand, then dictated revisions, racing against death to complete the manuscript. Grant's personal memoirs, completed just days before his death, are considered among the finest military memoirs ever written. Clear, honest, and insightful, they cover his life through the end of the Civil War. The prose is direct and unpretentious, reflecting Grant's personality. The book was both a critical and commercial success, earning nearly $450,000 in royalties and securing his family's financial future. Ulysses S. Grant died on July 23, 1885, at a cottage on Mount McGregor, New York. He was 63 years old. His funeral was one of the largest in American history, with over 1.5 million people lining the streets of New York to watch the procession. He was buried in a temporary tomb in Riverside Park. 12 years later, his remains were moved to Grant's tomb, a massive monument overlooking the Hudson River. Julia was buried beside him when she died in 1902. Grant's legacy is complex and has evolved over time. In the decades after his death, his reputation suffered. He was remembered as a butcher general who won through brute force rather than skill, and as a failed president whose administration was corrupt. This assessment was unfair but persistent. In recent decades, historians have reassessed Grant more favorably. His military genius is now widely recognized. His commitment to civil rights and racial justice is acknowledged and praised. Even his presidency, while still considered flawed, is recognized for its genuine achievements in protecting African American rights. Grant was a man of contradictions, a humble person thrust into positions of supreme authority, a soldier who hated war, a drinker who commanded armies, a failure who became president. He succeeded through determination, moral courage, and an ability to learn from mistakes. He failed when he trusted too much or when the problems exceeded his experience and skills. His greatest achievement was winning the Civil War and preserving the Union. His greatest failure was not being able to secure lasting protection for the rights of freed slaves, though this failure belonged to the nation as much as to Grant personally. In the end, Ulysses S. Grant was a great general and a mediocre president, but more importantly, he was a decent man who served his country faithfully in both war and peace. His life story, from obscure clerk to commanding general to president to bankrupt memoirist, is uniquely American. He rose from nothing, achieved everything, lost much, and died working to provide for his family. His legacy endures in the Union he saved and in the words he wrote, honest and clear, like the man himself. Ida B. Wells was a Mississippi-born journalist and a complex figure who became one of the most fearless crusaders for justice in American history. Ida Bell Wells, civil rights activist and investigative journalist, was born into slavery in Holly Springs, Mississippi on July 16, 1862. She came from a family that valued education and self-determination. She had a fierce intelligence and an unwavering commitment to truth. Wells's early years were marked by tragedy and resilience. Her parents, James Wells and Elizabeth Warrenton Wells, were both enslaved until the Emancipation Proclamation freed them during the Civil War. Her father was a skilled carpenter who became politically active during Reconstruction, serving on the board of trustees for Rust College, a school founded for freed slaves. Her mother was known for her deep religious faith and her determination to see her children educated. Young Ida attended Rust College, then called Shaw University, where she received an education that was remarkable for a young black woman of her era. When Ida was 16 years old, tragedy struck her family with devastating force. In 1878, a yellow fever epidemic swept through Holly Springs, claiming the lives of both her parents and her youngest brother. The disease killed thousands across the South that summer, but for Ida, the loss was personal and catastrophic. She suddenly found herself responsible for her 5 surviving siblings. Rather than allow the family to be separated and her siblings sent to different homes, Wells made a decision that revealed her character. She convinced local school officials that she was 18 years old and secured a position teaching in a rural school. She would rise before dawn, prepare her siblings for the day, walk several miles to the schoolhouse, teach all day, then return home to care for her family. It was an exhausting routine that would have broken many people, but Wells persevered. This period of her life forged the determination and independence that would characterize her entire career. Eventually, Wells moved to Memphis, Tennessee to live with an aunt, bringing some of her siblings with her. In Memphis, she continued teaching and attended summer sessions at Fisk University in Nashville to further her education. She began to build a life for herself in the growing city. Memphis in the 1880s was a complicated place for African Americans. The city had a substantial black population and some opportunities for advancement, but it was also a place where the promises of Reconstruction were being systematically dismantled. Wells would soon experience this reality firsthand. In 1884, an incident occurred that would transform Wells from a schoolteacher into an activist. She had purchased a first-class ticket on the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad for a trip from Memphis to Nashville. She took her seat in the ladies' car, as was her right as a first-class passenger. However, the conductor ordered her to move to the smoking car, which was the designated car for black passengers regardless of what ticket they had purchased. Wells refused. She had paid for first-class accommodation and she intended to receive it. When the conductor tried to physically remove her from her seat, Wells resisted. According to her own account, she braced her feet against the seat in front of her and bit the conductor's hand when he grabbed her. It took 3 men to drag her from the car. The other passengers, all white, applauded her removal. Wells did not accept this humiliation quietly. She sued the railroad company for discrimination. In 1885, a local circuit court ruled in her favor and awarded her $500 in damages. It was a remarkable victory, one that seemed to affirm that the law would protect the rights of black citizens. However, the railroad appealed to the Tennessee Supreme Court, which reversed the lower court's decision in 1887. The higher court ruled against Wells and ordered her to pay court costs. The decision was a bitter lesson in the reality of justice in the post-Reconstruction South. The law, Wells learned, would not protect black citizens when white interests were at stake. This experience radicalized her and set her on the path toward activism. During this time, Wells had begun writing for black newspapers under the pen name Iola. She wrote about education, race relations, and the conditions facing African Americans in the South. Her articles were sharp, insightful, and uncompromising. She criticized both white racism and what she saw as the accommodationist approach of some black leaders. Her writing attracted attention and she began to develop a reputation as a fearless commentator on racial issues. In 1889, Wells became co-owner and editor of the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight, a black newspaper. She used this platform to advocate for black rights and to expose injustice. She continued teaching while running the newspaper, though this dual career would not last long. In 1891, Wells wrote an editorial criticizing the Memphis School Board for the inferior conditions in black schools compared to white schools. She suggested that the real problem was not lack of funding but the board's indifference to black education. The editorial caused a scandal. Wells was not rehired for the next school year. The school board made it clear that her outspoken journalism was the reason for her dismissal. Rather than retreating, Wells decided to commit herself fully to journalism. She traveled throughout the South selling subscriptions to the free speech and building the newspaper's circulation. She became one of the few black women in America supporting herself through journalism. The event that would define Wells's life and legacy occurred in March 1892. 3 black men, Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Will Stewart, were lynched in Memphis. These were not strangers to Wells. Thomas Moss was a close friend, the godfather of her daughter. The three men had owned a grocery store called the People's Grocery, which competed with a white-owned store in the same neighborhood. After a confrontation between white and black residents in the area, the three men were arrested. A white mob dragged them from jail and murdered them. The official story claimed the men had been shot while trying to escape, but everyone knew the truth. They had been lynched. The lynching of her friends transformed Wells. She began to investigate lynching systematically, collecting data and analyzing the justifications given for these murders. What she discovered challenged the prevailing narrative about lynching in America. The common justification for lynching was that it was necessary to protect white women from rape by black men. This was the story told in newspapers, from pulpits, and by politicians. It was the excuse that allowed mobs to murder black men with impunity. But Wells's research revealed a different truth. She found that in most cases, lynching victims had not been accused of rape at all. They had been killed for economic competition, for not showing proper deference to whites, for trying to vote, or for consensual relationships with white women. Even in cases where rape was alleged, there was rarely any evidence, and often the accusation came only after the lynching had already occurred. Wells published her findings in the Free Speech in May 1892. Her editorial was explosive. She wrote that nobody in the South believed the old thread-worn lie that Negro men assaulted white women, and that if Southern white men were not careful, a conclusion might be reached which would be very damaging to the moral reputation of their women. The implication was clear: many of these alleged rapes were actually consensual relationships, and white women were complicit in the lie that justified lynching. The editorial caused outrage among white Memphians. A white mob destroyed the offices of the Free Speech. Wells was not in Memphis at the time, she was in New York on business. Friends warned her not to return, telling her that the mob had threatened to kill her on sight. Wells never returned to Memphis. Exiled from her home, Wells settled in New York and continued her anti-lynching crusade with even greater determination. She was hired by the New York Age, a black newspaper, and began publishing a detailed statistical study of lynching. In 1892, she published a pamphlet titled Southern Horrors: Lynch Law in All Its Phases. The pamphlet documented hundreds of lynchings and systematically demolished the justifications offered for them. Wells argued that lynching was not about protecting white women but about maintaining white supremacy through terror. It was about preventing black economic advancement and political participation. The pamphlet was widely distributed and brought Wells national attention. In 1893 and 1894, Wells traveled to Great Britain on 2 speaking tours. She believed that international pressure might force the United States to address lynching. Her speeches in England and Scotland drew large crowds and generated significant press coverage. British reformers and religious leaders were horrified by her accounts of American lynching. The tours created embarrassment for the United States and brought the issue of lynching to international attention. White American newspapers attacked Wells viciously for criticizing America abroad, but she was unmoved. If Americans would not stop lynching, she would use whatever platform she could find to expose it. Wells continued her anti-lynching campaign throughout the 1890s. She published another pamphlet, A Red Record, in 1895, which provided even more extensive documentation of lynching. The pamphlet included statistics, newspaper accounts, and analysis. It remains one of the most important historical documents on lynching. Wells traveled extensively, speaking to audiences throughout the North and Midwest. She organized anti-lynching societies and lobbied for federal anti-lynching legislation. She met with President McKinley to urge federal action against lynching, though her efforts to secure federal legislation were unsuccessful. In 1895, Wells married Ferdinand Lee Barnett, a lawyer and editor of the Chicago Conservator, one of the first black newspapers in Chicago. She moved to Chicago and became Ida B. Wells Barnett, though she continued to be known professionally as Ida B. Wells. The marriage was by all accounts a partnership of equals. Barnett supported his wife's activism and they raised 4 children together. Wells managed to balance her roles as mother, wife, and activist, though it was never easy. She often brought her children to meetings and events, refusing to let motherhood end her public work. In Chicago, Wells continued her activism but expanded her focus beyond lynching. She became involved in the women's suffrage movement, though her relationship with white suffragists was often strained. Many white suffragists were willing to sacrifice black women's rights to gain support from Southern white women. Wells refused to accept this compromise. At the 1913 suffrage parade in Washington, white organizers asked black women to march in a segregated section at the back of the parade. Wells refused and instead stepped out of the crowd to join the Illinois delegation as the parade passed by. It was a characteristic act of defiance. Wells was also involved in the Settlement House movement in Chicago. She founded the Negro Fellowship League, which provided housing, employment assistance, and social services to black men migrating from the South. The organization operated a reading room and social center that served as a gathering place for Chicago's black community. Wells understood that civil rights required not just political activism but also practical assistance to help people build better lives. In 1909, Wells participated in the founding of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, though her relationship with the organization was complicated. She was initially part of the group that formed the NAACP, but she was excluded from the list of founders when the organization was formally incorporated. Some historians believe this was because Wells was seen as too radical and confrontational by some of the organization's leaders. Wells was never one to moderate her views for the sake of organizational unity. She believed in direct confrontation of injustice and had little patience for compromise with racism. Wells remained active in Chicago politics and civil rights work throughout the 1910s and 1920s. She was involved in the campaign for women's suffrage and worked to ensure that black women would be able to exercise their right to vote once it was secured. After the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, Wells was active in voter registration drives in Chicago's black community. She also continued to speak out against lynching and racial violence. When race riots erupted in East St. Louis in 1917 and Chicago in 1919, Wells investigated and published reports on the violence. Throughout her career, Wells was often at odds with other black leaders. She criticized Booker T. Washington for his accommodationist approach to race relations. She believed that Washington's strategy of accepting segregation and focusing on economic advancement rather than political rights was a betrayal of black people. She was also critical of W.E.B. Du Bois at times, though they agreed on more than they disagreed about. Wells was difficult to work with because she refused to compromise on principles. She was confrontational, undiplomatic, and unwilling to moderate her demands for justice. These qualities made her an effective crusader but a challenging colleague. Wells's later years were marked by continued activism but also by a sense that her contributions were not fully recognized. Younger activists sometimes saw her as old-fashioned or too radical. The NAACP, which she had helped found, never gave her a leadership role. She ran unsuccessfully for the Illinois State Senate in 1930, one of the first black women to seek such an office. Though she lost, the campaign demonstrated her continued commitment to political engagement. On March 25, 1931, Ida B. Wells died in Chicago at the age of 68. The cause of death was uremia, a kidney condition. Her funeral was attended by thousands of people from Chicago's black community and beyond. She was buried in Oakwood Cemetery in Chicago. In death, as in life, Wells was remembered as a fierce advocate for justice who never compromised her principles. Wells's legacy is that of a pioneer in investigative journalism and civil rights activism. She was one of the first people to systematically document lynching and to challenge the narratives used to justify it. Her work laid the foundation for the anti-lynching movement of the early 20th century. Though federal anti-lynching legislation was not passed during her lifetime, her work brought national and international attention to the issue and helped shift public opinion. Modern historians recognize Wells as one of the most important figures in African American history and in the history of journalism. She pioneered investigative reporting on racial violence at a time when such work was extremely dangerous. She risked her life repeatedly to expose injustice. She refused to be silenced by threats, exile, or social pressure. Her autobiography, Crusade for Justice, published posthumously in 1970, has become a classic text in African American studies and women's history. Wells was also a pioneer for black women's activism. At a time when both racism and sexism limited opportunities for black women, Wells carved out a space for herself as a journalist, speaker, and organizer. She refused to accept that her gender should limit her activism. She challenged both white supremacy and patriarchy, often simultaneously. Her example inspired generations of black women activists who followed her. Perhaps Wells's greatest legacy is her demonstration that truth-telling is a form of activism. She believed that exposing injustice was the first step toward ending it. She documented lynchings meticulously, collecting names, dates, and circumstances. She published her findings widely, making it impossible for Americans to claim ignorance about what was happening. She understood that silence and complicity were allies of oppression, and she refused both. Her journalism was activism, and her activism was grounded in rigorous investigation and documentation. Wells also understood the importance of international pressure in advancing human rights. Her speaking tours in Britain brought international attention to American lynching and created diplomatic pressure on the United States. This strategy of appealing to international opinion would be used by later civil rights activists, including those involved in the modern civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Wells pioneered this approach decades earlier. The assessment of Wells's life must acknowledge both her tremendous achievements and the limitations she faced. She never succeeded in securing federal anti-lynching legislation, a goal she pursued for decades. She was often marginalized within the organizations she helped create. Her confrontational style sometimes alienated potential allies. She struggled financially for much of her life, as her activism left little time for more lucrative work. Yet these limitations do not diminish her achievements. She accomplished extraordinary things despite facing obstacles that would have stopped most people. In the end, Ida B. Wells was a woman of exceptional courage and integrity who dedicated her life to fighting injustice. She was exiled from her home, threatened with death, and attacked in the press, yet she never stopped her crusade. She understood that silence in the face of injustice is itself a form of injustice. She chose to speak, to write, to investigate, and to agitate for change, regardless of the personal cost. Her legacy is a reminder that individuals can make a difference, that truth-telling matters, and that courage in the face of oppression is always necessary. Wells was not perfect, but she was fearless, and that fearlessness changed history. Booker Taliaferro Washington was a Virginia-born educator and a complex figure who became one of the most influential African-American leaders of his era. Booker Taliaferro Washington, educator, author, and political advisor, was born into slavery in Halesford, Virginia on April 5, 1856. He came from the most humble circumstances imaginable. He had a commanding presence and a gift for oratory. Washington's early years were marked by hardship and an unquenchable thirst for education. He spent his childhood as a slave on a small plantation, never knowing his white father and seeing his mother only briefly in the evenings after her long days of labor in the plantation kitchen. His education there would come entirely through his own determination, though his later career would test those lessons in the most profound ways imaginable. After emancipation came in 1865, Washington's family moved to Malden, West Virginia, where his stepfather had found work in the salt furnaces. Young Booker was immediately put to work, first in the salt furnaces and later in the coal mines. These were brutal occupations for a child, but Washington was determined to educate himself. He taught himself to read and attended school whenever he could, often before dawn or after his work shift ended. It was during this time that Washington began developing his ideas about education and self-improvement. In 1872, at the age of 16, Washington set out for Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute in Virginia. He had heard about the school from miners and was determined to attend. He traveled the 500 miles mostly on foot, arriving dirty and penniless. The head teacher, skeptical of this ragged boy, told him to sweep a classroom. Washington swept the room 3 times and dusted it 4 times. He was admitted to the school on a work-study basis, paying his tuition by working as a janitor. Washington's years at Hampton were transformative. The school was led by General Samuel Chapman Armstrong, a white man who believed that African Americans needed practical education in trades and agriculture rather than classical liberal arts education. Armstrong's philosophy would profoundly influence Washington's own educational approach. Washington absorbed not only academic knowledge but also Armstrong's belief that African Americans must prove themselves worthy of equality through hard work, cleanliness, and moral character. He graduated with honors in 1875, delivering the commencement address to an audience that included wealthy Northern philanthropists who would later become important supporters of his work. After graduating from Hampton, Washington returned to Malden where he taught school for 3 years. He was a demanding teacher who insisted on cleanliness, punctuality, and proper behavior as much as academic achievement. He also attended Wayland Seminary in Washington, D.C. for a brief period, but he found the classical education there less practical than Hampton's approach. In 1879, General Armstrong invited Washington to return to Hampton to teach and to supervise the Indian students who were being educated there. This experience further shaped Washington's views on education and race relations. He saw education as the key to advancement for all disadvantaged peoples. In 1881, Washington received the opportunity that would define his life's work. The Alabama state legislature had appropriated money for a school for African Americans in Tuskegee, and General Armstrong recommended Washington to head the new institution. Washington arrived in Tuskegee in June 1881 to find that there was no school, no building, and no land, only the legislative appropriation for teachers' salaries. He had been given a mission but no resources to accomplish it. The challenge was enormous, but Washington was undaunted. He borrowed money to purchase an abandoned plantation outside of town and opened Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute on July 4, 1881 with 30 students in a shanty donated by a local church. Washington's vision for Tuskegee was ambitious and specific. The school would teach practical skills, agricultural techniques, and trades alongside basic academic subjects. Students would build the school themselves, learning construction, carpentry, and other trades in the process. They would grow their own food, learning scientific agriculture. They would make bricks, forge iron, and manufacture items the school needed. This approach served multiple purposes. It kept costs low, taught valuable skills, and instilled the work ethic and self-reliance that Washington believed essential for African American advancement. Critics would later charge that this approach prepared students only for menial labor, but Washington believed it provided the foundation for economic independence. The early years at Tuskegee were marked by constant struggle. Washington spent much of his time traveling throughout the North, speaking to churches, philanthropic organizations, and wealthy individuals to raise money for the school. He proved to be a gifted fundraiser, able to convince skeptical white donors that investing in African American education was both morally right and practically beneficial to the South's economic development. His ability to speak to white audiences in terms they could accept while still advancing his people's interests became his trademark approach. The school grew steadily. By 1888, Tuskegee owned 540 acres of land and had an enrollment of over 400 students. Washington had assembled a talented faculty and developed a comprehensive curriculum that combined academic instruction with industrial training. In 1882, Washington married Fannie Norton Smith, a fellow Hampton graduate who taught at Tuskegee. She died in 1884, leaving him with a young daughter. In 1885, he married Olivia Davidson, who had been instrumental in helping him establish Tuskegee. She served as lady principal of the school and was his partner in building the institution. She died in 1889, leaving Washington with 3 children. In 1893, he married Margaret Murray, another talented educator who would support his work for the rest of his life. These personal losses marked Washington deeply, but he channeled his grief into even greater dedication to his work. Throughout the 1890s, Washington's influence grew beyond Tuskegee. He became a sought-after speaker on race relations and education. White leaders in the South and North increasingly saw him as the voice of African Americans, though many African Americans themselves had different views. Washington's message was carefully calibrated to appeal to white audiences while still advocating for African American advancement. He emphasized economic progress over political rights, accommodation over confrontation, and gradual improvement over immediate equality. This approach would eventually generate fierce controversy within the African American community. The defining moment of Washington's public career came on September 18, 1895, when he delivered a speech at the Cotton States and International Exposition in Atlanta, Georgia. He was the only African American speaker at the opening ceremonies, addressing an audience that included white political and business leaders from across the South and nation. The speech he delivered, which became known as the Atlanta Compromise, articulated his philosophy of race relations and made him instantly famous. Washington urged African Americans to remain in the South, to work hard, to learn trades and agriculture, and to prove themselves worthy through economic success rather than political agitation. He told white Southerners that they could depend on African Americans for loyal labor and should invest in their education and economic development. The most famous and controversial passage of the speech used the metaphor of a hand. Washington said that in all things purely social, the races could be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. This acceptance of social segregation while advocating economic cooperation became the cornerstone of what critics called the Atlanta Compromise. White audiences, both North and South, enthusiastically embraced the speech. They saw Washington as a reasonable African American leader who accepted the racial status quo while working for gradual improvement. Northern philanthropists opened their checkbooks. Southern politicians praised him as an example of the right kind of African American leadership. President Grover Cleveland wrote him a letter of congratulation. However, not all African Americans celebrated the Atlanta speech. Many educated African Americans, particularly in the North, saw Washington's acceptance of social segregation and his de-emphasis of political rights as a betrayal. They believed he was asking African Americans to accept second-class citizenship in exchange for vague promises of economic opportunity. These critics would grow more vocal in the years to come, but in 1895, Washington's star was ascending. Following the Atlanta speech, Washington became the most powerful African American in the country. He advised presidents on African American appointments and policies. Theodore Roosevelt consulted him regularly and even invited him to dinner at the White House in 1901, an event that caused a scandal in the South. Washington controlled access to philanthropic funding for African American institutions. He influenced African American newspapers through subsidies and advertising. His approval could make or break the career of an aspiring African American leader. Washington used this power to build what came to be called the Tuskegee Machine, a network of supporters, institutions, and newspapers that promoted his philosophy and opposed his critics. He was not above using underhanded tactics to silence opposition. He secretly funded newspapers that attacked his critics. He used his influence with philanthropists to cut off funding to institutions that opposed him. He worked behind the scenes to undermine leaders who challenged his approach. This ruthless exercise of power contradicted his public image as a humble educator focused only on serving his people. The contradiction between Washington's public accommodation to white supremacy and his private efforts to fight it was profound. While publicly accepting segregation and disfranchisement, Washington secretly funded legal challenges to discriminatory laws. He contributed money to fight peonage cases and railroad segregation. He worked behind the scenes to oppose disfranchisement campaigns. He even funded anti-lynching investigations. These activities were kept secret because Washington knew that if white supporters discovered them, his influence and funding would disappear. The most sustained criticism of Washington came from W.E.B. Du Bois, a brilliant scholar and activist who had initially supported Washington but grew increasingly critical of his approach. In 1903, Du Bois published The Souls of Black Folk, which included an essay titled Of Mr. Booker T. Washington and Others that systematically critiqued Washington's philosophy. Du Bois argued that Washington's program asked African Americans to give up political power, civil rights, and higher education in exchange for economic opportunities that never materialized. He charged that Washington's leadership had coincided with the disfranchisement of African Americans, the legal establishment of segregation, and the withdrawal of aid for higher education. Du Bois acknowledged Washington's accomplishments but argued that his philosophy was leading African Americans toward permanent inferiority. The conflict between Washington and Du Bois represented a fundamental debate about strategy and philosophy. Washington believed that African Americans must first establish economic independence and prove themselves capable before demanding political and social equality. He thought that confrontational demands for rights would provoke white backlash and make conditions worse. Du Bois believed that without political power and civil rights, economic progress was impossible and that accepting inequality, even temporarily, was morally wrong and practically foolish. This debate would continue long after both men were gone, shaping African American political thought for generations. In 1905, Du Bois and other Washington critics formed the Niagara Movement, which demanded immediate civil rights and rejected Washington's accommodationist approach. Washington used his influence to undermine the movement, denying it funding and media coverage. The Niagara Movement struggled and eventually dissolved, but it laid the groundwork for the NAACP, which was founded in 1909 with Du Bois as a key leader. Despite the controversy surrounding his philosophy, Washington continued to build Tuskegee into a major institution. By 1900, the school had over 1,000 students and a faculty of nearly 100. The campus included dozens of buildings, all built by students. The school taught over 30 trades and had a significant agricultural research program. Washington recruited talented faculty, including the brilliant scientist George Washington Carver, who joined Tuskegee in 1896 and revolutionized Southern agriculture through his research on crop rotation and alternative crops. Washington also established the National Negro Business League in 1900 to promote African American entrepreneurship. The organization held annual conventions that brought together African American business owners from across the country. Washington believed that economic success would earn respect and gradually break down racial barriers. The Business League promoted his philosophy of self-help and economic development. Washington was also a prolific author. His autobiography, Up from Slavery, published in 1901, became a bestseller and was translated into multiple languages. The book told his life story from slavery to success and promoted his philosophy of hard work, self-improvement, and accommodation. It was read by millions and shaped how Americans, both black and white, understood race relations. Washington wrote numerous other books and articles, always promoting his vision of gradual progress through education and economic development. Throughout the early 20th century, Washington maintained his position as the most influential African American leader, but his power gradually eroded. The reality of African American life in the South was not improving as he had promised. Segregation became more entrenched. Violence against African Americans continued unabated. Disfranchisement was complete across the South. Economic opportunities remained limited. The promised rewards for patience and hard work did not materialize. Washington himself experienced the harsh realities of racism despite his fame and influence. In 1911, he was beaten by a white man in New York City after being found in a white neighborhood. The incident was embarrassing and highlighted that even the most famous and accomplished African American could not escape racist violence. Washington's health began to decline in 1915. He had driven himself relentlessly for decades, traveling constantly, speaking, fundraising, and managing Tuskegee. The strain took its toll. In November 1915, while in New York on business, Washington collapsed. Knowing he was dying, he insisted on returning to Tuskegee. He told his doctors that he was born in the South, had lived and labored in the South, and wished to die and be buried in the South. On November 14, 1915, Booker T. Washington died at Tuskegee. He was 59 years old. His death was mourned across the nation. Tributes poured in from presidents, philanthropists, educators, and common people whose lives he had touched. He was buried on the Tuskegee campus he had built from nothing. Washington's legacy is deeply contested. His supporters point to Tuskegee's success, the thousands of students he educated, and his ability to secure resources for African American advancement in an era of virulent racism. They argue that his accommodationist approach was the only practical strategy in the Jim Crow South and that he accomplished more than confrontational approaches could have. His critics argue that his acceptance of segregation and disfranchisement legitimized white supremacy and delayed the civil rights movement. They contend that his emphasis on industrial education limited African American aspirations and that his autocratic control of African American leadership stifled more militant voices. Modern historians recognize that Washington operated in an impossible situation. He had to navigate between white supremacists who wanted to keep African Americans subordinate and African American activists who demanded immediate equality. He chose a path of public accommodation while working privately for change, a strategy that satisfied neither side. His accomplishments were real. Tuskegee became a major institution that educated thousands. He secured millions of dollars for African American education. He created a network of businesses and institutions. Yet his philosophy of accommodation coincided with the nadir of African American rights and may have inadvertently provided cover for white supremacists. Perhaps the most balanced assessment recognizes Washington as a man of his time who did what he thought necessary to advance his people in an era of extreme racism. He built institutions that outlasted him. He educated a generation of African Americans. He proved that African Americans could achieve excellence when given opportunity. Yet his unwillingness to directly challenge segregation and disfranchisement limited what he could accomplish and created the conditions for more militant leadership to emerge after his death. Washington represents a particular type of leader, the accommodationist who works within an unjust system while hoping to gradually transform it. History has produced many such figures. Leaders who compromise with oppression while working for incremental change. Washington's tragedy was that the system he accommodated proved more resilient and more brutal than he anticipated, and the gradual progress he promised did not materialize in his lifetime. In the end, Booker T. Washington was neither a saint nor a sellout, but rather a pragmatic leader who chose a controversial strategy for advancement in impossible circumstances. His legacy includes both Tuskegee Institute and the Atlanta Compromise, both the National Negro Business League and his suppression of dissent. He is remembered today as a complex and controversial figure whose life and work continue to generate debate about strategy, leadership, and the best path toward justice and equality.